In the summer of 1878, when typhoid fever claimed the lives of 47 residents in Harper County, Kansas, four brothers named Blackwood displayed an immunity that defied medical explanation. But their survival came at a cost so grotesque that 3 different physicians refused to document their findings, and the Kansas State Medical Board quietly sealed all records related to the case. What started as divine protection became something far more sinister, a transformation so disturbing that the local Methodist Church burned every mention of the Blackwood family from their records. The brothers developed symptoms that no medical textbook had ever described, symptoms that grew progressively more inhuman with each passing day. By winter, neighbors reported that the brothers no longer cast proper shadows. Their voices had taken on harmonic qualities that made listeners' ears bleed, and their eyes reflected light like those of nocturnal predators. The final medical report, classified to this day, allegedly contained the phrase, "Subjects have transcended human biological classification," before all documentation was permanently sealed. Tonight, after nearly 150 years of silence, we're about to uncover why modern science still refuses to acknowledge what happened on that isolated farm, and why the truth about the Blackwood brothers might be more terrifying than any supernatural explanation. Before we continue with the story of Ezra, Caleb, Josiah, and Abel Blackwood, I need to ask you something important. This channel isn't for everyone, only for the bravest souls who dare to uncover the mysteries that others fear to tell. If you're one of those true mystery seekers, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what state or city you're listening from. Are you brave enough to learn what really happened when faith and science collided on the Kansas prairie? Now let's step back into 1878, where faith and fear walked hand in hand. The small farming community of Cedar Ridge, Kansas, existed as little more than a crossroads between wheat fields and cattle ranches in the late 1870s. With barely 300 souls scattered across the windswept prairie, it was the kind of place where everyone knew their neighbor's business, where a man's word was his bond, and where Sunday worship at the Methodist Church served as both spiritual guidance and social gathering. The harsh winters that brought blizzards capable of burying entire homesteads, and the scorching summers that could kill crops in a single week, had forged a population of stoic, God-fearing people who viewed hardship as divine testing and prosperity as heavenly blessing. The landscape itself seemed to encourage such thinking. Miles of golden wheat stretched to every horizon, broken only by the occasional farmhouse, windmill, or grove of cottonwood trees marking a creek bed. The sky dominated everything, vast, endless, and ever-changing. During thunderstorms, lightning would dance across the prairie for hours, illuminating the grassland in brief, brilliant flashes that revealed the true isolation of each homestead. In winter, the wind howled across the flatland with a voice that sounded almost human, carrying snow and cold that could freeze a man to death in minutes if he lost his way between barn and house. The Blackwood brothers had arrived in Cedar Ridge in the spring of 1872, purchasing 640 acres of prime prairie land with money inherited from their father's farm back in Clinton County, Ohio. The brothers had sold everything they owned, loaded their belongings into 2 covered wagons, and made the journey west with the determination of men following a divine calling. Ezra Blackwood, the eldest at 36 when they arrived, possessed the natural authority of a man accustomed to leadership and responsibility. Standing 6 feet tall with broad shoulders built by years of farm work, he carried himself with quiet dignity that commanded respect without demanding it. His weathered hands, scarred by countless hours of labor, could gentle a spooked horse or guide a plow with equal skill. But it was his eyes that people remembered most, pale blue like winter ice. They seemed to look right through a person to something deeper. Those who spoke with Ezra often came away feeling that he had seen straight into their soul and found them wanting. Caleb, 2 years younger than Ezra, served as the family's practical mind and business manager. Where Ezra led through moral authority, Caleb managed through careful planning and mathematical precision. He could calculate grain yields, livestock prices, and weather patterns with an accuracy that impressed even the most experienced farmers in the county. His ledger books, kept in meticulous handwriting, tracked every penny earned and spent, every bushel harvested, every head of cattle bought or sold. But beneath his practical exterior burned the same intense faith that motivated all the brothers. Caleb saw God's hand in everything, in the perfect geometry of a wheat field, in the precise timing of rainfall, in the mathematical harmony that governed the natural world. Josiah, the third brother at 31, had received the most formal education of the four. He had attended Ohio Wesleyan University for 2 years before their father's death called him back to the family farm. During those years, he had studied not only theology, but also medicine, philosophy, and natural sciences. His personal library, carefully transported to Kansas in a specially built crate, contained over 200 volumes covering subjects from biblical commentary to human anatomy. Josiah's room in the farmhouse resembled a scholar's study more than a farmer's quarters, with books stacked on every available surface and papers covered with his careful notes, filling wooden boxes beneath his bed. Abel, the youngest at 25, burned with religious fervor that sometimes concerned even his faith-driven siblings. Where the older brothers approached their devotion with scholarly depth or practical application, Abel's faith was pure emotion and absolute surrender. He spent hours each day in prayer, often weeping with the intensity of his communion with the divine. He fasted regularly, sometimes going days without food, while claiming that prayer and scripture provided all the sustenance he needed. His fellow church members back in Ohio had called him touched by the Spirit, but some had whispered that his devotion bordered on dangerous obsession. Unlike their neighbors who attended the Methodist church in town, a modest white-painted building with a bell tower that could be heard for miles across the prairie, the Blackwood brothers had constructed their own chapel on a hill overlooking their property. The building project had taken them the better part of their first year in Kansas. They had quarried limestone from a creek bed on their land, cut oak timber from a grove near the property line, and crafted every piece of the structure with their own hands. The chapel they built reflected their austere but deeply felt faith. The structure measured 30 feet by 20 feet, with walls of precisely fitted limestone and a roof of hand-split oak shingles. Inside, they had carved pews from local walnut wood, each one perfectly smooth and fitted with careful joinery that spoke of hours of patient craftsmanship. The altar, also hand-carved, bore inscriptions in Hebrew that Josiah had copied from his biblical texts. Tall windows on the east and west walls caught the morning and evening sun, filling the space with golden light during their dawn and dusk prayers. The brothers held their own services every Sunday morning and evening, following what they called primitive Methodist principles, a stricter interpretation of Wesley's teachings that emphasized personal revelation, direct communion with the divine, and the priesthood of all believers. Their services included longer periods of silent prayer, extensive biblical study, and what they called testimony of the Spirit, where each brother would share any divine revelations or insights he had received during the week. Their daily routine reflected their commitment to both faith and labor. They rose each morning at 4 o'clock for an hour of silent prayer in the chapel, watching the sun rise over the eastern prairie while they communed individually with God. After a simple breakfast of bread, milk, and whatever fruit was in season, they would spend the morning working their fields. The afternoon hours were devoted to animal care, equipment maintenance, and the countless tasks required to keep a farm operational. But evening was always reserved for spiritual pursuits, Bible study, theological discussion, and group prayer that often lasted until well after midnight. The brothers lived as bachelors, dedicating themselves entirely to their faith and their land, though this decision had not been without cost. Their farmhouse, a sturdy 2-story structure they had built during their second year in Kansas, reflected their utilitarian approach to life and their deep religious commitment. The walls displayed biblical verses carved into wooden plaques, each one selected for its relevance to daily farm life and spiritual growth. Every room contained at least one well-worn Bible, and several had additional religious texts that Josiah had determined were worthy of regular study. By the summer of 1878, the Blackwood farm had become a model of agricultural success and spiritual dedication. Their wheat fields stretched golden across the prairie. Their cattle grazed contentedly on healthy grassland. Their silo bulged with grain, and their chapel stood as a testament to their unwavering faith. The brothers had achieved everything they had hoped for when they left Ohio 6 years earlier: prosperity, independence, and the freedom to worship according to their deepest convictions. Their neighbors in Cedar Ridge respected the Blackwood brothers, though many found their intensity unsettling and their isolation from community life puzzling. The brothers were known for their honesty in business dealings, their willingness to help neighbors in times of crisis, and their reputation for hard work and fair treatment of the occasional hired hands they employed during harvest season. But they were also known for their unwillingness to participate in social gatherings, their refusal to engage in casual conversations, and their habit of evaluating everyone they met with those penetrating blue eyes that seemed to see straight through to a person's soul. When the brothers came to town for supplies, which they did every 2 weeks with military precision, they moved with quiet purpose and spoke only when necessary. They would arrive at the general store with a carefully prepared list, conduct their business with polite efficiency, and depart without engaging in the social pleasantries that other farmers enjoyed. Children often stared in fascination at the 4 identical beards, perfectly trimmed and coal-black, that gave the brothers an almost biblical appearance. The first case of typhoid fever appeared in Cedar Ridge on July 15, 1878, striking with the sudden violence that characterized the most virulent strains of the disease. Mrs. Sarah Hartman, who ran the general store with her husband Benjamin, had seemed perfectly healthy when she opened the store that morning, greeting customers with her usual cheerful demeanor and discussing the promising prospects for the wheat harvest. But by afternoon she was burning with fever, her skin covered with the characteristic rose-colored spots that experienced physicians recognized as the mark of typhoid. Dr. Samuel Morrison, the county's only physician, had been summoned from his rounds at the Henderson farm, where he had been delivering a breech birth that had taken most of the day. He arrived at the Hartman store to find Sarah delirious with fever, her temperature so high that it barely registered on his clinical thermometer. Her husband Benjamin, a normally calm and practical man, was pacing the store like a caged animal, wringing his hands and begging Dr. Morrison to do something, anything, to save his wife of 23 years. "Doc, she was fine this morning," Benjamin kept repeating, his voice cracking with desperation. "Fine as she's ever been. Served breakfast to the Henderson boys when they came for supplies, laughed at something young Tommy said about his new foal. How does a person go from healthy to this in the space of a few hours?" Dr. Morrison had seen typhoid before during his medical training in Philadelphia, but nothing quite like this. The disease typically developed over days or weeks, giving physicians time to attempt treatment and families time to prepare for the likely outcome. But Sarah Hartman's case seemed to have compressed the entire progression of the disease into a single devastating day. Her fever was higher than he had ever recorded in a living patient. Her delirium was complete and violent, and the rose-colored spots covered not just her chest, but her entire body, in patterns that seemed almost deliberate in their symmetry. Despite Dr. Morrison's best efforts, cold compresses, laudanum for the pain, and careful monitoring of her vital signs, Sarah Hartman died just after midnight on July 16th. But even in death, her case remained deeply troubling. The rigidity of her body set in far too quickly. Her skin took on a waxy pallor that suggested preservation rather than normal decomposition, and her eyes, which Dr. Morrison had closed according to proper procedure, kept opening again no matter how many times he pressed the lids shut. Within 24 hours of Sarah's death, 3 more cases appeared in Cedar Ridge. The victims seemed to have nothing in common except their use of water from the town's main well. a source that had provided clean, sweet water for the community since its founding. But when Dr. Morrison examined the well, he found evidence of contamination from runoff that had somehow breached the carefully constructed stone lining. The second victim was old Heinrich Zimmermann, a German immigrant who had farmed the same section of land for 15 years. Heinrich's case followed the same devastating pattern as Sarah's: perfect health in the morning, raging fever by afternoon, and death before dawn. But Heinrich's final hours were marked by something that Dr. Morrison had never encountered. The old farmer spoke in languages that no one in the community recognized, using words and phrases that sounded ancient and somehow threatening. The third and fourth victims were the Patterson twins, Emma and Ellen, two 16-year-old girls who had been among the most promising students in the county's single schoolhouse. Their deaths were particularly heartbreaking because they occurred simultaneously, as if the disease had coordinated its attack to claim both girls at exactly the same moment. Their father, James Patterson, later told Dr. Morrison that in their final delirium, the twins had spoken in perfect unison, reciting what sounded like prayers in a language that resembled Latin, but contained sounds that human throats should not have been able to produce. By August 1st, 14 people had died from the strange typhoid strain, and Dr. Morrison had documented symptoms and progressions that defied every principle of medical science he had learned. The victims all died within 24 hours of showing symptoms. Their fevers reached temperatures that should have killed them within minutes, and their final hours were marked by delirium that seemed more like possession than medical crisis. The fear that gripped Cedar Ridge during those terrible weeks in late July and early August was unlike anything the community had ever experienced. Families barricaded themselves in their homes, refusing to venture out except for the most essential tasks. The general store, now run by Benjamin Hartman with the help of his brother-in-law, became a place of whispered conversations and furtive glances. The Methodist Church, which had always served as the community's gathering place and source of comfort, stood nearly empty during Sunday services, as people feared that any congregation might provide the disease with new victims. Dr. Morrison had ordered the contaminated well sealed and advised all residents to boil their water. But the disease continued to spread with a pattern that suggested something more than simple contamination. The victims seemed to be chosen according to some logic that had nothing to do with their exposure to the well water or their proximity to previous cases. Some families lost every member, while neighboring households remained completely healthy. It was against this backdrop of terror and confusion that the Blackwood brothers made their fateful decision to involve themselves in the crisis. The brothers had remained isolated on their farm during the early weeks of the epidemic, following their usual practice of avoiding unnecessary contact with the town and its residents. But on August 10th, Josiah announced to his brothers that he had received what he believed was a divine revelation calling them to action. "I have prayed for guidance," Josiah told his brothers as they gathered for their evening meal. "And the Lord has shown me that this pestilence is a test not just of the community's faith, but of our own worthiness to serve as his instruments. We have been preserved from the disease not for our own safety, but so that we might demonstrate the power of true faith in the face of ultimate trial." The decision once made was implemented with the same methodical precision that characterized everything the brothers did. On August 11th, Josiah traveled to town to offer their assistance to Dr. Morrison and to volunteer their services in caring for the sick.